Shortly after midnight on April 1, 2006, a medical student named Brian Shaffer walked into a crowded bar in Columbus, Ohio. Security cameras clearly recorded him entering. Hours later, the bar closed and people poured out into the street. But Brian Shaffer never came out. Investigators reviewed every camera in the building. They could see him arrive. They could never find the moment he left. At the time of his disappearance, Brian Shaffer was 27 years old and halfway through medical school at Ohio State University. Friends described him as intelligent, sarcastic, and surprisingly outgoing for someone spending most of his days buried in textbooks and hospital rotations. Music was one of the few things that helped him relax. Brian played guitar and loved discovering new bands. If there was a live show in Columbus, there was a good chance he had already bought a ticket. Despite the pressure of medical school, people around him rarely saw Brian as someone overwhelmed by life. But the weeks leading up to that night had been unusually difficult. Brianna Euro's mother had recently died after a long fight with cancer. The loss changed the atmosphere in the family almost overnight. His father Randy tried to stay strong, but friends later said Brian seemed quieter than usual. Still, he continued with classes and tried to keep moving forward. Spring break was coming up, and Brian had been talking about taking a short trip to Miami with friends. Sun, music, and a few days away from the constant grind of studying. On the evening of March 31st, Brian met up with his friend William A. Clinta Florence. The two planned to spend the night visiting a few bars around Columbus. Nothing unusual. Students did the same thing every weekend. Around 1:15 in the morning they arrived at a place called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The bar sat on the second floor of the Gateway Entertainment Complex near the university. To reach it, customers had to ride a long escalator that faced directly toward security cameras. Anyone entering the bar passed clearly through the camera's view. At the time, the detail didn't seem important. Later it would become one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. For students at Ohio State, the Gateway Complex was a familiar place. Restaurants, bars, and movie theaters sat side by side, creating one of the busiest nightlife spots near the campus. On weekends the area filled with music, conversations, and long lines outside the most popular bars. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was one of those places. People often described it as loud, crowded, and unpredictable in the way college bars usually are. Security cameras watched the escalators and the main entrance, mostly to monitor fights or intoxicated customers. No one inside the building at night could have imagined that those same cameras would soon become the center of a missing person investigation. Because the cameras recorded Brian walking into the bar that night. But somehow none of them ever recorded him leaving. Inside the Ugly Tuna Saloon, the atmosphere that night was exactly what you would expect from a crowded college bar. Music echoed across the room. Groups of students gathered around tables. Conversations blended together with the sound of glasses and laughter. Brian seemed comfortable in that environment. People who saw him later told investigators he didn't appear stressed or upset. If anything, he looked relaxed. At one point during the night, security cameras captured Brian just outside the entrance of the bar. The footage shows him standing near the railing, talking with two women. For a few minutes they laugh and continue their conversation. Nothing about the moment suggests danger. There is no argument. No tension. No sign that anything unusual is about to happen. Eventually the two women turn and walk back inside the bar. Brian follows them. That short clip of security footage would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Because after that moment, Brian Shaffer is never clearly seen again. Meanwhile, inside the bar, the night continued as usual. People kept drinking. Music kept playing. More students arrived while others slowly began leaving. Around closing time, Brianna Euro's friend Clint Florence prepared to head home. Another friend, Meredith Reed, was also ready to leave. Both of them believed Brian had already stepped outside. It wasn't uncommon for friends to separate at the end of the night. Sometimes someone would leave early. Sometimes a phone battery would die. And sometimes people simply assumed everyone else had already gone home. Clint and Meredith left the building and walked toward their car. They waited for Brian for a while. Minutes passed. Then more time passed. Eventually they assumed Brian must have left with someone else or taken a different ride home. So they drove away. At that moment, nothing seemed strange. But the following day would reveal a troubling detail. No one had seen Brian after that conversation outside the bar. Not inside. Not outside. Not anywhere in the Gateway complex. And when investigators later reviewed the surveillance cameras, they discovered something that made the case even more disturbing. The cameras clearly showed Brian entering the bar that night. But the footage never showed him leaving the building. The next morning, Brian Shaffer's phone stayed silent. Calls from friends went straight to voicemail. At first, nobody panicked. After a long night out, it wasn't unusual for someone to sleep late or forget to charge their phone. But as the day continued, something started to feel wrong. Brian missed a planned meeting with his father. He didn't respond to messages. Hours passed with no word from him. By the evening of April 1st, concern was beginning to grow. Brianna's father, Randy Shaffer, had already been dealing with enormous grief. Just weeks earlier he had lost his wife to cancer. Now his son was suddenly unreachable. At first Randy believed Brian might simply be out with friends or recovering from a late night. But when the phone continued ringing unanswered, worry slowly turned into fear. Soon the situation could no longer be ignored. Brian Shaffer was reported missing. Police in Columbus began what they assumed would be a routine missing person investigation. Cases like this often resolved quickly. Someone would eventually answer their phone. A friend would remember seeing the missing person leave with someone. Sometimes people simply took a short trip without telling anyone. At the beginning, investigators had no reason to believe Brianna's disappearance was anything unusual. The last confirmed location was easy to identify. He had been seen at the Ugly Tuna Saloon. That was where detectives decided to start. Officers spoke with employees and staff members who had worked that night. They interviewed bartenders, security guards, and anyone who might remember Brian. But no one could clearly explain when he left. Several people remembered seeing him inside the bar earlier in the night. After that, the details became unclear. Some believed he had already gone home. Others thought he might have stepped outside for a moment. None of those explanations helped investigators determine what had actually happened. So detectives turned to the one piece of evidence that could provide a clear timeline: the surveillance cameras inside the Gateway complex. Dozens of cameras had recorded the entrances, escalators, and walkways throughout the building. Investigators expected the footage to answer their questions quickly. Instead, the recordings would create a mystery that no one could explain. Because when detectives began reviewing the video, they noticed something strange. They could see Brian Shaffer arriving at the bar that night. They could see hundreds of other people entering and leaving the building. But somehow, in hours of surveillance footage, Brian Shaffer never appeared walking out. When detectives began reviewing the surveillance footage from the Gateway complex, they expected the mystery to resolve itself quickly. Cameras covered the escalators, entrances, and most of the hallways connected to the bar. Dozens of people appeared in the recordings. Students arrived in groups. Others left alone or in pairs as the night slowly came to an end. Investigators carefully followed the timeline. At first everything looked normal. Brian could be seen riding the escalator up toward the ugly tuna saloon shortly after midnight. Later, the footage captured him speaking with two women outside the entrance of the bar. That moment had already been identified as the last confirmed sighting of him. From there, detectives expected to eventually see Brian leaving the building. But as the hours of footage continued, something unusual began to emerge. Everyone else appeared. People walked down the escalator. Some exited the complex through the main doors. Others stopped briefly in nearby restaurants before leaving. But Brian Shaffer never appeared on any of those cameras. Detectives watched the recordings again. Then again. Frame by frame, investigators studied every person who entered or left the building. Yet the result never changed. Brian entered. But he never appeared leaving. This discovery raised an unsettling question. If Brian didn't walk out through the main exit, how could he have left the building at all? One possibility involved a service exit used by employees. Some staff members mentioned a door that led into restricted areas of the complex. Another theory focused on the construction that was taking place nearby. Parts of the Gateway building were still being renovated at the time. Temporary walls and maintenance corridors created areas that cameras didn't fully cover. If someone had known the layout well enough, it might have been possible to leave the bar area without passing directly in front of the main cameras. But even that explanation created new problems. Because despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, investigators never found a trace of Brian. No witnesses saw him leaving through side streets. No security footage from nearby businesses captured him outside. It was as if Brian had stepped into a place where the cameras simply stopped watching. And that possibility would soon lead detectives to consider a much darker explanation for what might have happened inside the building that night. As the investigation continued, detectives explored every possible explanation for Brian Shaffer's disappearance. One theory suggested that Brian might have left the bar unnoticed and chosen to disappear voluntarily. But the evidence never supported that idea. Brian left behind his phone, his bank accounts remained untouched, and no verified sightings ever surfaced after that night. Friends also struggled to believe he would simply abandon his life. He had plans for the future. Medical school was demanding, but Brian had already invested years of work into becoming a doctor. He had also been looking forward to a trip to Miami with friends during spring break. Nothing in his recent conversations suggested he wanted to vanish. Another possibility involved an accident somewhere inside the building. Investigators searched nearby areas repeatedly, including construction zones and service corridors connected to the Gateway complex. If Brian had somehow become trapped or injured in those spaces, there should have been evidence. Yet none was ever discovered. As months turned into years, the case slowly became one of the most puzzling disappearances in modern true crime. Investigators continued to review the footage and re-examine witness statements. Independent researchers and online communities began analyzing the timeline as well. Many believed Brian must have exited the building through an area not covered by cameras. Others suspected that something far more sinister occurred inside the bar itself. Without physical evidence, however, every theory remained speculation. Throughout those years, Brianna's father Randy never stopped searching for answers. He spoke to investigators, followed leads, and held on to the hope that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to his son. Then in 2008, tragedy struck the family once again. Randy Shaffer died after being hit by a falling tree branch during a storm. He passed away without ever learning the truth about Brianna's disappearance. Today the case remains unsolved. The footage still shows the same thing detectives saw nearly 2 decades ago. A young man walks into a crowded bar late at night. Music is playing. People are laughing. The escalator carries him up toward the entrance. And then the recording ends. Somewhere between that moment and the closing of the bar, Brian Shaffer disappeared. And despite years of investigation, one question continues to haunt everyone who studies the case. How can someone walk into a building filled with camera and never be seen leaving again?